Welcome to Theory Neutral, the podcast about stuff languages do.
I'm Eden.
I'm Logan, and today we have guest George Corley from the Conlangery podcast with us to talk about a typological study of stress deafness by Sharon Peperkamp and Emmanuel Dupoux. So, both Aiden and I have been over on George's podcast before for an episode each, and now it's finally George's turn to come over on our podcast. Hello, George.
Hello.
Hi. I had a paper that I thought would be interesting to you guys. I would have suggested one of my favorite typological papers that actually was very formative in how I think about stress and tone, but I think you did it on episode 2.
This is the one about why pitch accent isn't a thing?
Yes, why pitch accent is not a thing.
Yeah, there's a reason that we picked that one very early on, and it's probably the same reason why you wanted to do it.
Well, it's a very good paper, and it's also outlining something that, you will hear in a lot of intralinguistics classes, and it is wrong. And it's kind of important that it's wrong because it limits how people can think about those languages.
Yeah.
So today, I thought I would bring something a little bit different. This is a paper that I came across while working on my dissertation, and it was one of those things that it's tangential to what you're working on. And so you save it, you put it in your reference manager, and you kind of forget it because this is talking about metrical systems and acquisition of metrical systems, but I was working on acoustic correlates of stress, and it doesn't really talk much about that. And it's also not relevant to the languages I was studying because I'm doing English and Chinese, both of it which are outside of this typology. But the interesting thing about this paper is it's a different angle to construct a typology. Because I think typically when you're talking about typology papers, and this isn't really a typology paper either, it's an experimental paper, but when you're talking about typology papers, it's usually somebody goes and reads a whole bunch of grammars and is trying to figure out a whole bunch of languages and figure out some systematic way of, the tagline of your show is what languages do. Figuring out what languages do in a more general model, whether that's categories or a continuum or an implicational hierarchy or some multi-dimensional thing even, just to figure out where the possibility space is, right?
Yeah, pretty much. What do languages do?
Yes.
How are the different ways that this system can be handled? What do those all look like? That sort of thing.
In a systematic and simplified model so that we can comprehend it, right?
Yeah.
But this paper was not aiming for that. They were aiming to use their typology experimentally in order to determine facts about language acquisition. And so you see the difference between, the typical approach and this approach, because the categories that they construct are not really what you would usually do. So they're talking about stress systems, and you would expect stress systems to have, you'd probably go, what syllable is typically stressed, final, penultimate, antepenultimate, initial, and then whether stress is regular or not, whether it's weight sensitive, these kinds of things. And all of that fits into this. But the main thing that they're looking at is how much information does an infant need in order to acquire the stress system and then forget about it because it's regular. So we're only talking about phonologically regular stress systems. That's why English is excluded, because English is not.
Yeah, English has lexical stress.
Yeah. They actually use Spanish as a control, which is another thing that's outside of the paradigm because it has lexical stress that's not predictable. So their hypothesis is that, and they couch this in basically generativist terms, where they're saying there is a stress parameter. And if an infant can set a stress parameter at a certain point, then they will become stress deaf. They will have stress deafness, which they always put in quotation marks. But that means that as an adult, they will have difficulty distinguishing stress minimal pairs in another language. And they are trying to figure out at what point that is, because their whole idea is that once the stress parameter is set, they just ignore stress in the perception part, right?
Yeah, especially in languages where the stress, I mean, they go through and classify languages by how much information, but like in the extreme case of like, you just don't really have to know anything about what's going on in order to sort of know where to put the stress. And it's like, yeah, you just don't care about almost any information. It's just purely automatic. You don't have to listen for stress at all. And so your brain just throws all that information out the window entirely.
So I want to do a little foreshadowing here, because I was very pleased by Table 2 at the very end of the paper, which seems to indicate that there is not actually a stress parameter after all, which is not what I was expecting.
Yeah, so that's a thing. I think that their actual findings indicate that each of these levels, like, it's like a gradual loss of sensitivity depending on when stress is observable.
Yeah, the boundaries are fuzzy.
Let's get into, I think I'll actually talk about their like framework, which is explained a little bit more in another paper, which is Dupoux and Peperkamp 2002. See what they did there. Whereas the main paper we're talking about is Peperkamp and Dupoux. Here's the general idea. They think of it as babies must start with some kind of universal representation that would cover all languages. And that can get them a certain degree of information. They can get some information that's observable from a whole utterance, right?
They can tell when someone starts and stops talking, and like notice when someone is talking versus when it is silent, and where the boundaries are.
Yeah. And then the next level is a pre-lexical representation where they have access to some of the phonology, things like syllable structure and maybe some of the phonemic relationships, some of the contrastive relationships, but not everything because they haven't like divided words yet.
Yep.
Then they start to subdivide function words from content words. And that's been shown experimentally to happen very early.
Mm-hmm.
All of this happens like within the first year. And then finally, you get to where they can segment content words out from each other. And their sort of hypothesis is that the stress parameter will get fixed at some point along this chain and then get ignored at some point before you would have stress attached to individual words. At that point, they stop attending to stress and just apply the regular rule, and this affects how they will perceive other languages.
So the way that I understood the theorized implicational hierarchy is that if a child is able to set this parameter that says, yes, I have regular stress early on, then they become quote-unquote stress deaf. And so wherever the cutoff is at the hierarchy, where the latest point is that can be set, like if they do set it, then all of the levels on the hierarchy before that point imply stress deafness. So like if you only need utterance level information to set that parameter or not, then they would predict that like French and Finnish, which just have utterance initial or utterance final stress, those kinds of languages would produce stress deafness. But if you have any other kind of regular stress system, then the baby isn't going to figure out that it's regular until too late. And so they won't have set the parameter, so they're still gonna, like, learn to pay attention to it anyway. So if the parameter gets set sufficiently late, then, like, anybody who has any kind of regular stress system would be, quote-unquote, stress deaf. But if it gets set earlier, then certain types of stress systems, even though they're regular, don't get acquired until later on, and so the baby would still be paying attention to it, and so then they won't be stress deaf.
Right. So they're trying to find what that point is. And to do that, they've classified languages. So you've talked a little bit about the first class, which their examples are French, which is aggressively stress final, to the point where stress will actually shift onto enclitics in order to be at the end of an utterance or at the end of a phrase or something.
Yeah, stress is always at the end of a phrase.
Right.
Regardless of the contents of that phrase.
Right.
It's just incredibly predictable.
It's so predictable in that way that, like, people argue that there's not word stress at all. It's only phrasal stress and all these things. But the main thing is, for their purposes, is it's observable from utterance edges.
Yeah. You don't have to know anything about the inside.
And then finish is the opposite in that it is stress initial and it doesn't have any proclitics. It doesn't have anything unstressed that can come before. So it will always predictably be at the beginning of an utterance.
Yeah, the difference being that with French, you can tell that it just doesn't matter. You can put stress on anything as long as it's the last syllable, no matter how grammatically minimally important that is. Whereas in Finnish, it's not possible to put any sort of grammatical function element into a position that would be stressed because they all come at the end and stress is at the beginning. So you can't really tell whether or not you would, in theory, just put it at the beginning regardless of the contents, because the contents always align themselves in such a way that it comes on a root. But nonetheless, it's still entirely predictable. It just comes at the beginning.
Yeah, and that's part of what I'm talking about, is that it doesn't really matter the details of how stress gets assigned to them. It only matters whether it is retrievable from only the level of the utterance without any phonological modeling. So French and Finnish, and it doesn't necessarily have to be stress final or stress initial. I think in another one of the papers that I've linked here, they mention a possibility of a language that has penultimate stress but doesn't allow monosyllabic words. Then it would still be observable from the utterance edges. It's all about, like, what's observable to the child. The second level, which they don't actually test in their paper, and I think that's one weakness we can talk about if we talk about weaknesses in their actual experiment.
And some of that is just because it seems like they don't necessarily have ready access to speakers of a language from this class to test, because their one example that they give is Fijian.
Yeah, so Fijian or Fijian has weight-sensitive stress.
It says word stress falls on the final syllable if it's heavy, otherwise it's penultimate, which is, I mean, that's basically Latin stress rules minus the Latin extrametricality of the final syllable thing. But it's weight sensitive is the core point.
Yeah.
At one edge of the phrase, but it's not entirely predictable just from edge. It's predictable from edge plus some other phonological properties.
Right.
So the child doesn't need to know anything about word boundaries or different types of words yet, but they need to know what the syllable structure of their language is.
Right. They need to know syllable structure, and they have to be able to detect heavy versus light syllables, which the requirements for what is a heavy syllable varies from language to language, but they should be able to pick that up. But they do need some language-specific phonological modeling in order to get this. They just don't need to segment any words at all.
Yeah. And if I have understood the typology correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, George, because you've read more about it than I have, the weight sensitivity is just like the particular feature that happens to show up in Fijian, but weight sensitivity is not specifically a defining feature of this second level of the hierarchy. It's just the general idea that you need some phonological information below the level of just utterance boundaries, but not like getting to the level of needing to figure out word boundaries yet.
Yeah, I don't think they ever cover like other possibilities that much. Weight sensitivity is probably the easiest thing to do because, like, that's probably the biggest purely phonological thing that could happen to make you have to know a little bit of the structure of the language.
Yeah, it's hard to think of any other kinds of parameters that you'd have to care about unless it was like tone-driven stress assignment or something, but then you probably got all sorts of extra complicating factors.
Right. But I mean you could have the mirror image of Fijian and it would still be the same thing where you have initial stress for a heavy syllable and then pen initial, which that would be a very strange language, but it's something you can imagine.
Yeah.
And so the main thing is that they need to have started to construct the phonology, specifically syllable structure in this case, in order to set the stress parameter in their terms.
Mm-hmm.
Number 3, the type 3, you need to differentiate function words from content words. And they cite research saying that infants can do this very early on and actually learn the function words very early on.
Yeah. Not necessarily what their function is, but the fact that, like, these are super high frequency items that probably don't have lexical content.
Right.
And distinguish them from more contentful words.
Yeah, and so the example that they give here is Hungarian, which has Finnish-style word initial stress very aggressively, except there actually are things that you can put in front of words that are, just plain old grammatical elements, and it turns out those don't take stress the same way that, like, the inverse would in French, where you put something after the word, then now it just pulls the stress. And they give the example here where you have emberek, men, versus az emberek, the men, where the az is just a function word article, but it doesn't pull stress, and so the whole phrase has stress on the second syllable because the first syllable is an unstressable function word.
Right.
So the idea here is that a child at the appropriate stage wouldn't necessarily have figured out what emberek means, and wouldn't have necessarily figured out what az means, but they could have figured out that, az is a thing that I hear a whole lot, and it's all over the place, and it doesn't seem to refer to anything, so, like, we'll put that in the function class, and emberek is another thing that I don't hear as often, and so we'll put that in the content class, and then actually figuring out how to assign meanings and grammar to those comes later.
Well, more than that, too, not just that it doesn't mean anything, but, like, also it has phonological properties of a functional element.
Yeah.
Because function words, they're never stressed, they tend to be short, they tend not to have longer vowels, there's all kinds of things that are kind of language specific, but still will differentiate function words from content words phonetically that children apparently do find very early on.
Yeah, they are simpler in whatever simpler means, very language-specific ways, but they're sort of overall just kind of simpler than content words.
For example, this is by no means universal either, but in lots of languages, function words use only a subset of the total phonology. So, like, in Salish languages, the set of phonemes that you can use for prefixes is ridiculously small, which results in a large amount of homophony for grammatical stuff.
Oh, okay.
So that would be easy for a child to identify. Like, if you hear a bunch of words that all use, like, the same 3 phonemes, then they're probably grammatical, and everything else is content words.
Yeah, it depends on the language, but I think almost universally function words will tend to be unstressed all the time, unless you're, like, emphasizing them for some reason, like teaching them or something.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, other properties might be a little bit more language specific. They'll tend to be simpler, but how are they simpler? Well, you have to figure that out. But that brings us to class 4, which is now you need to segment content words. And their example is Polish, which Polish has completely regular penultimate stress, except for a few exceptions, which we'll get to, like, why the exceptions are important.
Foreshadowing.
Yes, but you can say it has regular penultimate stress for native words at least, but you can have monosyllabic words. And if you have 2 monosyllabic words at the end of an utterance, there's a stress clash and they de-stress the first word. So now you have a situation where at the end of an utterance, it could be on the penultimate syllable or the final syllable, and the only way to resolve that it's regular is to find the word boundaries and see, these 2 are monosyllabic words, and that's why this is happening. I just am applying the regular stress clash rule, but the idea is that at some point before Polish, the stress parameter is set so that before they can get to where they're segmenting content words, babies are just assuming that they have lexical stress and paying attention to it anyway.
Yeah. So I want to just interject at this point to note that prior to reading this paper, the total amount of attention that I had paid to the classification of stress systems was that some languages have unpredictable lexical stress and some other languages have predictable stress. And so, now we're focusing only on different types of predictable stress. And it turns out that, regardless of how you feel about the generative theoretical assumptions behind this experiment design and the motivation for this typology, they have identified 4 reasonable different categories of how regular stress systems could work. And, I would have been totally happy with having learned something cool if that were the entire paper. But now we can move on to the actual experiments that they did and why they did them and what the results were and all that stuff, which is just icing on the cake as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I mean, it is very interesting, but I don't think you would have had this particular typology if they didn't have the goal that they wanted.
Yeah.
Because coming up with this idea was all about, okay, we need to figure out how much a baby needs to know in order to know that this is regular stress. That's the whole typology, is figuring that thing out.
Yep.
And so here it is. You have the 4 levels. You need basically nothing. Just presumably they believe that there are universal phonetic representations that they can use in order to figure out roughly where syllables are and things, but nothing else. Then you need some language specific phonological information. Then you need segmenting out the function words. Then you need segmenting content words. And it's a very interesting system and a very interesting way of classifying things. It's also I was happy to bring it to this podcast because it's something that there are ways that I could apply it to conlanging and talking about it in a conlanging context, but it's much more of something that's in a language acquisition context that makes this interesting as a typology. But we can talk about their experiments. So they didn't have any class 2, and they ended up using French, which they had tested previously in another paper that I don't think I even linked because I don't think it's going to add much. But they tested French and Finnish and Hungarian and Polish, which I think it's a bit of a weakness that they only had 2 representatives of one class and then 1 representative of 2 other classes. This is sort of a thing with a lot of linguistic research is people use convenience samples and you don't really, you end up with small sample sizes of limited numbers of languages. But they felt that it was good to at least give some evidence to their point. So that's how they did it.
And specifically, it was already known that Polish people are not stress deaf. And so, that observation kind of motivates the whole question. Polish has a regular stress system, but unlike French people, Polish people can identify stress minimal pairs in other languages. Therefore, not all predictable stress systems produce stress deafness. So, let's go investigate which ones do and why. And it's probably related to, the acquisition timeline.
Right. And Peperkamp wrote a whole other paper in 2004 about this part, is that Polish has exceptions to their stress rules, mostly from loanwords. So, they have, I think the word menu was borrowed from French, and it has final stress. And I think they have one that has antepenultimate stress. But basically, we see observational evidence in their lexicon that they are not stress deaf.
Yeah, because they're able to borrow the placement of stress when they borrow words from other languages, rather than just adapting it.
Yeah, but it's also worth noting that the authors of this paper at least sort of assume, they state very clearly that they assume that there's not a large enough number of these irregular stress loanwords in Polish to impact its classification as a regular stress system rather than a fundamentally lexical stress system.
Right, because infants are not going to be hearing these exceptions terribly often. They're going to be acquiring the regular system.
Yeah.
Right, and that's a point that Peperkamp goes into further in the other paper. They're assuming that these are low-frequency words that do not occur at utterance edges very often. And so there are scenarios that you can imagine where you get a whole lot of loan words that have unusual stress, and that actually turns it into a lexical stress language with irregular stress. But that's not what happened to Polish, seemingly. Polish still seems to have regular stress with a few uncommon exceptions, like Muzyka, Universitet, and Menu. These are all borrowings of Greek and Latin origin that are not super common and not necessarily going to interfere, but we have evidence that Polish people store the stress in the lexicon.
Well, and particularly, they're not going to be super common in infant-directed speech. Like, how often are you talking to a less than 1-year-old about universities?
Yeah. Or menus.
Well, yeah. Music probably
maybe,
a lot, but
yeah.
not... I can think of ways that it would happen, but it's just that they're not going to be high-frequency words. So they had stress minimal pairs that they repeated to people and had them repeat back. And then they contrasted that with a segmental pair. And they did have to do some changes to their protocol, I think, when they got to Hungarian, because one of the nonce words they were using was actually a word in Hungarian.
Yeah. The construction of the stimulus sets is actually kind of interesting to talk about because they used nonce words.
Right.
But they had to be, like, in order to get an accurate psychological reading, they had to use words that were, like, phonologically licit, like possible words that were not actual words.
Right.
And they needed to use, as much as possible, the same words between all of the languages, which did not 100% work out. Like you said, they had to adjust a little bit. But in particular, I like the fact that you mentioned at the beginning, George, that you had studied the acoustic correlates of stress, because they do, in fact, have to consider the acoustic correlates of stress, because like not all of these languages that they were testing have stress that is acoustically encoded in the same way. So when they created their stimuli, like they had to make sure to adjust the different acoustic correlates so that the speakers of each language would actually recognize the same syllables as being stressed or not.
Right. And let me talk about that. So the specific thing that they were concerned about there was duration, because both Hungarian and Finnish have phonemic vowel length. So the concern that they had was that they would perceive that duration change as a phonemic vowel length, which is a totally legitimate concern. I'm glad that they were paying attention to that. But duration is one of the big three. You have loudness. They talk about intensity, but loudness is more accurate because there are different ways to operationalize it. Pitch and duration of the coda. And obviously, if you have phonemic vowel length, then duration as a cue is going to be deprioritized a little bit. They say they avoid it. I don't know if languages that have phonemic vowel length avoid duration as stress so much as it's de-emphasized. So they tried to avoid that, and they did a little pilot study, I think with one speaker, to make sure that their duration effects wouldn't be perceived that way. And like looking at the data, there was something to worry about a little bit in the first syllable of their nonce word was mipa. The E vowel was quite a bit longer, but in the I's, it's like very small. And in order to be a vowel length distinction, it would have to be 1.5 to 2 times as long as the short vowel. So I think they did pretty well at avoiding that problem. but it's something to pay attention to when you're interpreting the results. But that's just a technical thing that happens anytime you're doing experimental stuff. Like, I used real English words when I did my experiment, and let me tell you, trying to get balanced samples and stuff, it's hard. And my sample is definitely suboptimal, and there are things that I missed when I was constructing them. Notably, I have like coda nasals and didn't realize that coda nasals are treated differently by English speakers and Chinese speakers, and that caused me problems. So that's something to think about if you're interpreting the results here, is that like they had to try to make sure that the duration effects are not going to cause an issue. But they got some data out of this that was interesting.
Yes, very.
They spin it as being a bit more clear in support of their theory than it actually is, I think, because...
I would agree with that, yes.
Yeah, the significance ratings are pretty small, and you're right, Logan, in that it doesn't show a clear line of this is where the parameter has been set. What you see when you look at their table 2 is French are really stress deaf. They have a lot of problems.
Yeah.
And Finnish and Hungarian are about the same.
The same as each other, not the same as French.
Yeah, about the same as each other, right.
Yeah, they do better at identifying stress distinctions, but still not, like, super great.
Yeah, and then Polish is doing much better, and then their control of Spanish has a negative value, which I don't know what that means.
You're extra good at hearing stress or something to that effect.
They give the definition of their index. We define a stress deafness index as a mean percentage of errors made with the stress contrast minus the mean percentage of errors made with the phonemic contrast.
Okay, so that's where the negative is.
So Spanish people messed up the phonemic contrast more than they messed up the stress contrast.
And only by a little bit.
Yeah.
They did very well on both.
Yeah, it's a very low magnitude negative number. So basically, like, Spanish people can tell stress differences as well as they can tell segmental differences. And Polish people are better at segmental differences than stress differences. So not as good at stress as Spanish people, but still, like, way better than Hungarian and Finnish and French.
Yeah. And, there is a question of whether there is this vowel length perception happening because Finnish and Hungarian are so similar.
Yeah, that was going to be my biggest concern with these numbers, is because the two languages that have contrastive vowel length have almost identical deafness index numbers.
Right.
One is 24 and the other is 23.7. Like, that's basically the same.
Yeah, unfortunately, they didn't put their actual, stats stuff into a table, so I'd have to, dig into the text to remember if that difference was significant or not. But there seems to be some effect based on their data.
Yeah, for sure there is. There is a clear climb, if nothing else, from French through Finnish and Hungarian, and then Polish, and then Spanish.
So, at least the ordering of their hierarchy does mean something.
Right. It does seem to mean something. The weaknesses are they only had these 5 languages tested. So there's limits to how much you can interpret based on idiosyncrasies of these languages that we might not even know. We know about the vowel length thing, but we don't necessarily know everything. And they also don't have any representative from class 2, which is something that would really solidify what they're talking about.
Yeah, and Finnish and Hungarian, which are so similar, are class 1 and 3.
Yeah.
So, class 2 should be right smack in the middle there.
Or have no statistical difference, at least, between those two.
Yeah. It seems like there's sort of a zone in the middle. Maybe it's one of these things where you have multiple parameters, and when you set this one as minus, it's about the same thing as setting that one as plus, kind of a thing.
Right.
Or another possible explanation that they give is that it's just variation amongst individuals.
Right.
Maybe there is still this binary parameter where at some point a child makes the decision that okay, I don't need to pay attention to stress, or okay, I do, and so I'm going to. But where that happens is not like a universal for all humans.
Right.
And, maybe some people do it at 3 months and some people do it at 10 months.
Right.
And so that could produce a distribution of test subjects that then results in a continuous range of scores per language.
I mean, breaking away from their theory, another possibility is that, like, I'm outside of academia now, so I'm not, like, publishing my theories on language acquisition anywhere, but I have this notion, and I'm sure that somebody somewhere has proposed this, that, like, maybe it's less about these, like, parameter settings that generativists like to state, but more like as you build up your language system, that gets fixed in place and therefore is affecting how you learn second languages. And that kind of an idea probably would fit with more of a continuum of stress deafness from like the French to the Polish example.
Yeah. My personal interpretation of this, I am also not a generativist, which, that's probably the first time I've said it on this podcast because, we're theory neutral. We try to avoid getting into theoretical arguments. We don't always succeed, as you may have noticed in episode 2, but we do try. But yeah, I'm not a generativist, so I look at this and it feels to me like the most obvious explanation is if your language requires you to pay attention to more information to figure out the stress, then you're gonna pay attention more to stress. And that would be, like, how much attention you pay to it is going to be a continuous variable.
Right.
So.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. But we can let language acquisition theorists duke it out about that and not do it on this podcast.
Yes, indeed. That's all we need to say.
But it is super interesting. And it gets you thinking about typology in a different way because this is typology with a different goal. We're not trying to figure out what the possible stress rules are. We're trying to figure out how you could learn these stress rules, which is super interesting.
Yeah, this is typology more in the service of sort of the general linguistics goals of understanding the human language system.
Yeah.
And that's a good segue to a quote where they actually have a theoretical prediction about acquirability. I'll just read the quote directly. Our final assumption concerns the linguistic input and states that stress is phonologically transparent at utterance edges. So this is an assumption that they're making going into setting up this experiment, that all of these levels of the typology are based on this idea that babies are going to pay attention mostly to the edges of utterances to figure out stress rules because that's what's available most easily. So, by this we mean that the distribution of word stress is not obscured at utterance edges in that initial or final words do not have a deviant stress pattern. In particular, contrastive stress should not be neutralized at the beginning or end of some phrasal constituent. Such unattested neutralization would give rise to a regular pattern at one of the utterance edges, thus inducing infants to incorrectly conclude that stress is not contrastive. So, they're basically saying that based on the acquisition process, based on this model of how the acquisition process works, there are certain types of stress systems that should not be possible in natural languages, and so far are in fact unattested. So that is potentially an avenue for further research.
Right. I think another thing that is not directly related to this, but that this makes me think about is how can we do this kind of thing with languages that don't have regular stress rules? Because languages that have lexical stress still have rules. Like in English, you can explain how stress works by dividing words into classes and having like different stress patterns apply.
Like the noun-verb alternation, record versus record. And
that, I think I've seen a paper that divides into 4 different classes that have different like metrical patterns that you can identify. Spanish, it's only on the last 3 syllables, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the regular rule is penultimate, but you can have final and antepenultimate stress. probably any language that has quote-unquote lexical stress or contrastive stress has some regularity to it, and that could affect how we learn other lexical stress languages. I know that I had trouble initially. I did learn it, but I had trouble initially, and I have observed other English speakers have trouble pronouncing the word Tagalog, because looking at that and having that coda G at the end makes me automatically want to pronounce it Tagalog.
Yep, I have exactly the same experience. That is something I had to consciously learn, that it was supposed to be Tagalog, and practice at that.
I said the word to my mother once, and she interpreted it as Tagalog because she had the same issue. It's just she heard it and then deleted something in order to interpret it according to her English brain, right? So you have to think about I think Tagalog has lexical stress too, right? So you have these two languages that have lexical stress, but because the regular patterns involved are different, then they could interfere and you could have differences. I mean, think about, I don't even know how well Spanish speakers do on secondary stress in English.
Yeah, that's actually another possible confounding factor, is that Finnish has a fairly complicated secondary stress system.
Right.
So it's not just French is just last syllable is stressed, nothing else is stressed, end of discussion. But Finnish has a lot going on after the initial main stress. Mm-hmm. And so that may also be confounding some of this data that we've got here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe either the boundaries between their classes are not quite drawn at exactly the right places, even though those choices look like really natural places to me, having... But, I'm biased because they laid out an argument for it, so of course it looks natural, because I read the argument for it. But either the boundaries are just drawn in not quite the right places, or maybe Finnish has been misanalyzed and it's not actually in Class 1.
I want to put out to your listeners, does anyone out there who's listening know of more recent research on this? Because I was trying to find any more recent papers, because in my head, I half remembered a version of the system that had 6 classes, but that could just be my memory being bad. But this paper is 20 years old. So maybe there has been some progress on this stuff that I'm not aware of, and if anybody's aware of it, let me know and send me the paper. It would be interesting to see any further research in this vein, even if I'm not 100% sold on their theoretical framework. It is interesting to explore languages this way and see how the amount of information you need to determine stress is regular can affect how you perceive stress going forward into adulthood.
Yeah, for sure. Send us any papers that you've got that seem like they might expand on this question a little bit more.
Yeah, okay. I will say, if people want to listen to me and talk about conlangs and also netlangs a lot, but in a context of helping you create a language that is naturalistic, or just have ideas of what options are out there for you to play with in your own language that you make, then you can go to conlangery.com.
Yes, go listen to it. There is a wealth of wonderful information there. I have been listening for many years and highly recommend it. Thank you for joining us, too.
Yes. Well, I was happy to be here.
Theory Neutral is made possible by our listeners, families, and friends. Follow us on Blue Sky at Theory Neutral, or send us an email at theory.neutral.podcast@gmail.com. Join us next time when we will be discussing vowel systems.